I now call to order the Committee on House Administration for purposes of today's hearing, Transforming the Government Publishing Office for the 21st Century and Beyond, Part 4 of our hearing series examining Title 44, the U.S. Government Publishing Office and the Federal Depository Library Program. The hearing record will remain open for 5 legislative days, so members may submit any additional materials they wish to include. A quorum is present, so we may proceed. Before I get into the substance of today's hearing, I would like to begin by thanking all of the stakeholders of GPO and the FDLP who have been engaged in this process over the past several months. I know that this has been a long process as the committee, through regular order, has worked to review Title 44 as it relates to the U.S. Government Publishing Office and the Federal Depository Library Program. I would like to give special thanks to GPO Director Davida Vance Cooks, who has appeared twice before this committee and has answered nearly 100 detailed questions for the record. And I thank her for her cooperation and her openness in this effort. I also want to thank a number of the associations, such as the American Library Association, the Association of Law Libraries, the Medical Library Association, Association of Research Libraries, the Association of Southeastern Research Libraries, and the Digital Library Federation, who have all provided both formal and informal input into the committee's research. To the countless individual librarians from all types of libraries across the country, including public, law, and academic, who have taken the time to share insights, provide testimony, attend meetings, and open their doors for tours, I would like to say thank you for your dedication and service to our communities. Today's hearing will cover a myriad of topics in which this committee would like further information or clarification. As we've learned through this review process, much of Title 44 dates to the Printing Act of 1895. This act codified the public printing laws of the federal government, specifying the details of public documents, centralized all federal printing at GPO, and established the superintendent of documents. Additionally, GPO and its stakeholders are asking for new authorities. We will be looking at 5 unrelated areas of Title 44 reform. First, the role GPO plays in the legislative process. Second, congressional oversight of GPO as an agency in the legislative branch. Third, constitutional principles of separation of powers as it relates to Congress' control of federal printing and executive branch agencies. Fourth, allowing GPO grant-making authority. And fifth, permanent retention and preservation of both tangible and digital materials in the FDLP. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here, and we look forward to hearing from them. I would like to now recognize my colleague, Democratic member on the committee, Jamie Raskin, for the purpose of providing an opening statement. Before he proceeds, I'd also like to thank him for his joint efforts in this endeavor. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for calling this hearing, and I want to thank the witnesses also for appearing today to offer testimony. It's an honor, as the newest member of the committee, to get to make an opening statement on this important occasion. The input of the witnesses today is critical as we examine best how to support GPO in the process of modernizing its operations and adapting for the 21st century. Maintaining the official records of a constitutional democracy like ours is a sacred public duty. In authoritarian societies, it's essential to extinguish public memory and alter public records, but in democracy, it's essential to protect public memory and to maintain our records. The preservation of public records is a core service the government provides and is providing today, whether online through the federal digital system or in person at one of the 1,200 federal depository library locations across the country. GPO keeps our citizens informed and actively engaged in government. Mr. Chairman, as a newly installed member of the Joint Committee on Printing, I had the great pleasure yesterday of touring GPO, where I saw firsthand how seriously the staff and the employees are taking this responsibility. I met with staff members at GPO who work late into the night every day, waiting for Congress to wrap up our daily sessions in order to receive the Congressional Record for preparation for printing the next morning. I met with copy editors in GPO's print shop who pour through the Congressional Record looking for spelling and grammatical errors. I think I offered a couple of them jobs in my office. I toured the ID card manufacturing area where GPO staff is taking painstaking care to design and manufacture counterfeit-proof ID cards for highly secure events, including the most recent presidential inauguration. I visited the printing floor where reams of paper, including congressional publications and the Federal Register, are printed and sorted with amazing speed. And I got to see firsthand some of America's last few remaining artisans schooled in the arts of bookbinding and marbling, which is a dazzling process which only a handful of people still know today. But marbling is the process that allows for the pages to have these kinds of colorful designs on them. I learned during my tour that behind the creation of the documents that record the story of American government are early rising and passionate public servants, many of them my constituents in Maryland, Mr. Chairman. There are multiple shifts who are working over there at GPO, but it's a 24-hour-a-day operation, sometimes 7 days a week. And the people there, most importantly, take extraordinary pride and honor in their work. One of them is my constituent, John Crawford, a native Washingtonian and proud Marylander who's been with GPO for 51 years and says he has no interest in retiring because he loves the work that he's doing. He started as a journeyman bookbinder on the night shift in 1966 and is today the managing director of plant operations. So public servants like John deserve, obviously, not just good wages and job security, but our respect and admiration for the job that they're doing for us. And I know that our efforts to reform Title 44 will honor their service and commitment to America. I'm eager to learn more about GPO's operations from this panel's perspective today as customers and as participants in the Federal Deposit Library Program. In thinking about changes, we must listen carefully to the libraries. Not all of them have large endowments or active boards. Many of them rely on shrinking local budgets, and we need to give real consideration to a grant program that could empower them with the tools that make these documents available. So thanks again to the witnesses for their time and their candor, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for convening us in this hearing. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I would now like to introduce our first panel's witness. The Honorable Karen Haas serves as the Clerk of the U.S. House of Representatives. Ms. Haas was sworn in as Clerk of the House of Representatives for the 115th Congress on January 3rd, 2017. She's the 34th individual to serve as Clerk and previously served through the 109th, 110th, 112th, 113th, and 114th Congresses. As Clerk of the House, Ms. Haas plays a central role in the daily operations and legislative activities of the House and is the point of contact for many functions of the Government Publishing Office. Madam Clerk, the committee has received your written testimony. You will have 5 minutes to present a summary of this submission. You know how the timing device works, so you'll be a green light for the first 4 minutes and then a yellow light for the last minute and then red when the time is expired. The Chair now recognizes Ms. Haas for purposes of an opening statement. Welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Harper, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today to discuss our partnership with the Government Publishing Office and the future legislative support needs of the House. The responsibility of the Office of the Clerk is to support the legislative requirements of the U.S. House of Representatives. The professional men and women of our organization accomplish this each day by working closely with our business partners. One of the most important partners is the Government Publishing Office. On a daily basis, we work with GPO to compile and print the complete record of the daily business of the House, process bills and reports, and make legislative data available electronically to members, staff, and the public in a timely and accurate manner. In addition, GPO also supplies the House with letterhead and envelopes, publishes congressionally mandated books, prints special event programs and invitations, and binds official publications. However, GPO provides far more than print services. It supplies and maintains the printers we use to enroll measures and produce the journal used at the start of each legislative day, as well as the parchment paper and presentation cases for presenting enrollments to the President. We also require GPO's proofreading expertise for large enrollments and many official documents. GPO employees are often detailed to House committees and other institutional offices to lend expert support for processing legislative documents and compiling legislative history. They also provide the databases to make our data electronically available to members, staff, and the public. This list is not exhaustive, but as you can see, the products and services GPO provides are extensive and critical to our daily operations. As the primary liaison to GPO for the House, my team interacts with the organization daily, often beginning before dawn to coordinate the arrival of the Congressional Record and measures for floor consideration, continuing throughout the day and into the night with the processing of the day's bills and reports, and finalizing the record for the day. Today, GPO plays an important role in the efforts to make the legislative process more transparent. In June of 2016, GPO was tasked with managing the More Documents in USLM project to publish enrolled bills, public laws, and statutes at large in a machine-readable format. When this project is complete in late spring of 2018, it will represent a big step forward in how we access and use legislative data, while also opening the door to convert additional documents. As the committee looks to modernize the legislative process and GPO's work, we believe there's several key points to consider. One, previous mandates on the number of printed copies are not necessary, but some number of copies is required for legislative operations. Flexibility is important. The round-the-clock services provided by GPO are critical to the legislative process of the House of Representatives and must remain. GPO is an indispensable part of the evolving effort to modernize how we prepare, distribute, authenticate, and archive legislative data. The ongoing standardization efforts should continue. Support beyond print and technological expertise is needed. The ability to enlist additional proofreaders or detailees to help committees or offices with their documentation process is essential. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to come before the committee today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Madam Clerk, for your testimony. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit to the chair additional written questions for the witness, which we will then forward and ask the witness to respond as soon as possible so that your answers could be included as a part of the record. And I thank you for being here and for all of your hard work. And I know in your testimony you state that although the required quantity of printed copies of documents has decreased, the Office of the Clerk must have the flexibility to coordinate with those documents' customers to determine what is needed. Would it be helpful if Title 44 gave you and the Secretary of the Senate the ability to determine quantities of documents produced by GPO rather than just making it a specification in the law?
I do think it would be helpful to allow us to manage our customers' needs. So providing that flexibility, I think, would be important, but I would leave it up to the committee as to the best way to accomplish that. Sure,
but if you had the ability to determine that on a case-by-case basis, you believe your office could accommodate that, and that would give you that flexibility?
I do.
Okay. And if we were coming in with a specification as to a number, that sometimes can be rather arbitrary.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we need to, as you're thinking about this going forward, think about the future and the technology changes we've already seen.
Sure. And it is always a challenge to anticipate that technology changing.
That's right.
Also, I know that you certainly strive to provide the transparency and public access to the House's activities. Are there any additional ways in which the House and GPO could work together to increase access?
I would suggest that we continue the efforts with the Bulk Data Task Force. I mentioned in the testimony that we already have a project in the works that GPO is managing. There are several other documents that need to also be translated and moved into the USLM format, and I would suggest that we continue to have GPO partner with us in that effort.
Great. You know, the committee has certainly heard from other customers about GPO's billing practices. As the House's primary point of contact, how would you describe GPO's billing? And is it timely, accurate, understandable? Help us clarify that.
Sure. Several years ago, we identified that as an issue, quite honestly, for us in managing the items that were going down to GPO. And we worked closely with GPO to refine the billing practices at the time. We regularly receive the source documents from them so we can compare what is processed through the clerk's office and with GPO. We've also taken it upon ourselves to work on our requisition system, and we've updated and modernized that requisition system from the House. What I would suggest is that we would work with GPO going forward on their side of that practice to continue to modernize that practice. But over the last several years, we have seen an improvement in how GPO has provided us the data on a regular basis.
Okay, thank you. The House makes makes audio-visual recordings of committee meetings and floor proceedings. Are there ways that the House could improve long-term access to these recordings?
I think that's an excellent question. Currently, I'm aware of a couple ways that the videos are made available. They're made available on congress.gov through the library, and I believe that's a system that the committee put in place. We also have the archive copies of the committee video that's part of their committee archive for the future, and those are placed at the National Archives. So, and then in addition, I know members make their video available on YouTube, on their YouTube channels. So, as far as I know at this point, the Library of Congress is working well, but I would really defer to the committee on how they'd like to see that going forward.
Well, thank you for your input and the great work that your team does. And Chair will now recognize Mr. Raskin for 5 minutes for any questions he may have.
Chairman Harper, thank you very much. I want to follow up on the Chairman's first question about the Congressional Record and how many copies need to be made for that, and should there be more flexibility to meet what the actual needs are. Can you give us a sense of where the printed copies go now? You know, I understand that there were members of Congress and presidents, I think Lyndon Johnson, maybe Senator Berta, used to read the Congressional Record every day. I don't know if there are that many people who do that now, since you know, we do have our TVs on and we're able to kind of keep track of what people are saying. But where are most of them used here on Capitol Hill, or are they sent out across the country? Are they in library? I mean, where are the actual hard copies going?
Well, I can speak only to the ones that come to Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
And so, as you mentioned, the members' offices are not getting the copies as they used to. A large quantity comes to the Legislative Resource Center to make them available to members and the public if they're interested in getting a copy. It is available online, as you know, but they're also very important to our day-to-day operations. We use them on the House floor. We use them in our legislative operations team, our official reporters, legislative counsel. So there's entities within the House that need the Congressional Record to operate each day. We also have copies available on the floor that's part of our regular proceedings each day to see that that information is out there and available to members when they're on the floor.
Gotcha. Do you think there's a role for the private sector to play in the work of preserving the Congressional Record?
I think that would be open to discussion. I think one of the keys right now is how the information is available currently on FDSIS, the authentication process that takes place through GPO, and the key is to continue to archive it. One of the responsibilities of the clerk is to keep copies of any publication, 2 copies in our archives for history purposes and forever. And so we also keep paper copies as well as electronic of the Congressional Record.
Are you working actively with the GPO to figure out ways to improve public access to information about what goes on in the House?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, tell me how that process works.
Sure. So I mentioned in my testimony, GPO has been a partner for many years with us, most recently with the Bulk Data Task Force that was established, and that what was behind that effort was a real desire by our customers, both internal and external, to get legislative data. So GPO has been able to provide the expertise. They have the databases available where they display our information, and they have taken the lead on different documents that the House produces and putting them in a standardized form that then outside groups can take that information and use it to their benefit.
Gotcha. All right, well, that's all I've got now, Mr. Chairman. I'll give it back to you.
I want to thank you for your appearance today, and I know you would love to answer a lot more questions, but before we close with you on the first panel, is there anything that you would care to add in light of the questions that have been asked?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. That will conclude our first panel, and we'll take just a moment to set the second panel of witnesses on the table. I want to thank each of you for being here today to assist us on what has become a very important mission for us this year as we review Title 44, talk to the various stakeholders. And I'm going to take a moment now to introduce each of you. Eric Peterson is a specialist in American national government with the Congressional Research Service, who will discuss the role of the Joint Committee on Printing and the constitutional principles of separation of powers as it relates to Congress's control of federal printing and executive branch agencies. Robin Dale is the Deputy Director of Library Services at the Institute of Museum and Library Services, an independent agency in the executive branch who will discuss federal grant making to libraries. Roger Schoenfeld is the Director of Libraries and Scholarly Communications Program at Ithaca S+R, a not-for-profit service that helps academic and cultural communities effectively use digital technologies, who will discuss preservation of tangible and digital materials. The committee has received each of your written testimonies. Each witness will be given 5 minutes to present a summary of that submission. You've seen how it works with the clerk that just testified. You have a button, obviously, to turn on your microphone, and then the timer clock will work there. And so the chair would now recognize our witnesses for the purposes of their opening statements, and I'll begin with you, Dr. Peterson, and you're allowed 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The Joint Committee on Printing, established in 1846, and GPO, established in 1861, have played central roles in ensuring public access to government information. At the same time, changes in governance and information technology have raised questions about the roles and activities of the Joint Committee, and in some cases, the capacity of GPO to carry out its missions. With regard to governance, JCP's authority to oversee and enforce statutory authorities that mandate government printing through GPO have been widely questioned by the executive branch since the 1983 Supreme Court decision in Immigration and Naturalization Service versus Chadha. Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel has twice concluded that many of JCP's authorities, particularly provisions mandating JCP's prior approval from before an executive agency can have materials printed outside of GPO, have been invalidated by Chadha. And I would hasten to mention that I'm not an attorney. In this case, I'm speaking more to the policy consequences. From OLC's perspective, executive agencies are able to procure printing services from providers other than GPO. And since then, for the governance reasons, GPO workloads and revenues have declined, and agency-controlled printing and publishing efforts have resulted in an unknown number of fugitive documents being created and not getting into GPO's federal digital system or into the collections of the Federal Depository Library participants. And what this does is potentially makes them unavailable to policymakers or the general public. Another concern raised by congressional and other observers arises with regard to the Joint Committee and include questions as to whether or not its responsibilities might formally be performed by other entities. With regard to technology, government and information and publishing authorities, as the chairman noted in his opening statement, have remained in substantially the same state as they were when they were first enacted in the 19th and 20th centuries, before digital creation and distribution became the norm. The online version of the U.S. Code mentions current JCP authorities in about 60 sections. 37 of those sections were originally enacted a century or more ago, chiefly in the Printing Act of 1895. Similarly, GPO is subject to 129 code sections in Title 44, of which 105 were first enacted during or prior to 1917. Some of these authorities over the past quarter century have been called into question by the Government Accountability Office, the National Academy of Public Administration, and in an earlier session of this hearing, the Director of GPO. And while there does appear to be broad recognition of the shortcomings of some current authorities in Title 44, the way ahead is complicated by the lack of a stable, robust set of technology and information management practices similar to those that were in place when Congress enacted the bulk of government information policies. By 1895, the written word on a tangible object was a technology that had a 4,000-year track record. In the fourth or fifth decade of transition from the tangible written word to ubiquitous digital creation and distribution, permanent retention or preservation of those formats is still challenging. And instead of a fixed standard as is available for tangible printing products, digital preservation and retention efforts have not yet produced a digital equivalent with the preservation capacity of tangible items. And until and unless we get to a point where we have that, any effort to establish standards for the production and retention of digital materials runs the risk of potentially privileging a current standard or denying Congress, the American people, and GPO the opportunity to take advantage of some as yet undiscovered sets of technologies. I think that's a good place to leave it for the moment. Thank you again for inviting me to testify, and I'll be happy to address any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson. The chair will now recognize Ms. Dale for 5 minutes for her testimony. Thank you, and welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Harper, Congressman Raskin, and of course the other members of the committee. On behalf of the Institute of Museum and Library Services Director, Dr. Catherine K. Matthew, I want to thank you for this invitation to submit testimony before the House Committee on Administration as you examine the modernization of the Government Publishing Office. I first would like to take a moment and give you a brief overview of IMLS, where I serve as the Deputy Director for Library Services. The Institute of Museum and Library Services is the federal agency with the primary responsibility for ensuring the availability of museum, library, and information services to meet the essential needs of the people of the United States. IMLS is an independent grant-making agency and the primary source of federal support for the nation's approximately 120,000 libraries and 35,000 museums and related organizations. IMLS was created with the passage of the Museum and Library Services Act of 1996, which, as amended, authorizes the agency to award financial assistance, collect data, form strategic partnerships, and advise the President, Congress, and other federal agencies on museum, library, and information services. The agency consolidates federal library and information services programs dating back to 1956 and federal museum programs dating back to 1976. IMLS ensures critical access to the development of library services throughout the United States, its territories, and Native American tribes pursuant to the Library Services and Technology Act. IMLS supports library initiatives that facilitate innovation and workforce development through competitive grant programs. Our Grants to States program is the largest federal funding support for library services in the United States. It's designed to stimulate the use of state and local funds for library improvement throughout the nation. It encourages states to implement comprehensive programs to meet library services needs of their residents by establishing state library administrative agencies, or SLAAs as we call them, and they're charged by laws with the extension and development of library services. 59 state agencies now ensure that library services reach individuals in every state and territory. To receive federal support from IMLS, an SLAA must submit a plan that details library service goals for a 5-year period and describes activities that will be supported with the the assistance of federal funds. Each state is then responsible for leveraging non-federal, state and local match funds it receives to increase the impact of the investment. In addition, each state must sustain a maintenance of effort level of state funding on libraries and library programs to ensure that federal funds enhance and do not supplant state funds. They may use the funds to support state initiatives and services. They may also distribute the funds through competitive subawards or also in cooperative agreements with public, academic, research, school, tribal, and special libraries or consortia. And every year, over 1,500 Grants to States projects carry out these statutory purposes, ensuring the availability of library services, by providing access to electronic databases, computer instruction, homework centers, digitization of special collections, access to ebooks and adaptive technology, and tools supporting workforce development. A priority of the program is to address the needs of underserved communities and persons having difficulty using libraries. More than 10% of our grant funds over the last several years have been used to support library services for individuals who are blind or visually handicapped or have other disabilities. IMLS funds also support libraries' provision of science, technology, and engineering and math, or STEM programs designed to meet the needs of their communities. Library users receive hands-on instruction in science and technology to which they would normally not have access. This program supports career development as well as robust inquiry and skills essential for all citizens to lead productive and informed lives. At the end of each 5-year period, SLAAs evaluate their library programs based upon their original 5-year plan. These plans and evaluations are the foundation for improving practice and delivering services, and they must file annual financial and programmatic reports. Our statutory responsibilities for grant making also include a range of competitive grant programs, including grants to Native American tribes, including federally recognized tribes, as well as Alaska Native villages, regional corporations, village corporations, and organizations that primarily serve and represent Native Hawaiians to enable access to library services. National leadership grants to support innovation, and the Laura Bush 21st Century Librarian Program to help build a diverse and qualified librarian workforce. We handle all aspects of grant administration, applying proper controls to ensure equity, fairness, and fiscal management and oversight. For example, our peer review process is central to its grant-making function, and professionals with experience and expertise in a vast array of library disciplines and practices review all proposals from eligible institutions. Peer reviewers help ensure that financial assistance is provided for projects that are appropriate to the applicant's capability and the scale of the overall program, as well as define project goals, and we conduct cost analyses of these projects. We monitor and oversee grantees, requiring that they maintain fiscal control and employ accounting procedures that ensure the proper disbursement for and accounting of federal funds, and our agency has been recognized as a model for transparency, results-based goals, and priority setting, as well as for responsiveness and spending discipline. And we're going up. So in conclusion, I would like to thank Chairman Harper and the committee members for this opportunity to provide testimony on behalf of IMLS, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Dale, and it's good to know no trap door opens up as you go a few minutes.
That is correct. Well, I
over.
watched it go down, and then I missed that the numbers would then go up once you were speaking over. So
We're good. We're good. Thank you very
sir.
much for your testimony. The chair will now recognize Mr. Schoenfeld for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Harper.
Or 5.5 minutes. which you prefer.
We'll see. Chairman Harper, Mr. Raskin, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify here today. I'm a librarian who's led a number of projects examining preservation issues in the transition from print to digital. Nearly a decade ago, I led 2 consulting projects focused on structural challenges facing the Federal Depository Library Program and how the vital work of that program can be sustained. Today, I will focus my remarks on factors I hope you will consider related to the long-term preservation of government publications. Preservation is an imperative for ensuring permanent public access, and it has several components beyond simply storing and retaining publications. First, there are technical issues such as physical security, disaster planning, file preservation, and format changes. And second, there are governance issues, including how preservation is organized and funded. I want to focus on organizational issues today, both for print and for digital preservation. At a time of transition from tangible to increasingly digital access for many information resources, it remains essential that at least some print copies be retained. Because of research that I commissioned from a Berkeley operations researcher, we have a framework for determining the number of print copies of a given item that are needed for preservation purposes. Depending on a number of factors, including the condition of the collection and whether the materials are in circulation, we may need fewer than 10 copies to ensure their long-term preservation. Federal government publications with widely available trusted digital copies are well suited to this type of analysis. But the FDLP is not organized to optimize for the preservation of print materials that are increasingly accessed digitally. Academic libraries today are banding together into what I call trust networks to take collective responsibility for print collections. Each library individually can thereby reduce the space and other resources devoted to print collections. Trust networks typically involve a more explicit commitment to retention and, in some cases, preservation than any single library was ever able to make for similar materials on its own. The Association of Southeastern Research Libraries is a case in point. Participating libraries focus on a certain agency or set of agencies, committing to build and maintain a collection more rigorously than the FDLP itself mandates. This type of distributed but systematic approach is a fantastic model for what the future of the program could look like. Trust networks like this one frequently cross state boundaries, which is a challenge for the FDLP's state-based model. Looking ahead, the FDLP should evolve along with library preservation strategy to allow a trust network of libraries to serve in the role of the regional repository. GPO should integrate the Preservation Stewards Program and its regional discard policy along these lines and run them more proactively to ensure preservation in modern, yet robust and systematic ways. As government publications are now typically issued in digital format, it is essential that this format also be preserved. But many federal publications are not being gathered up into the FDsys GovInfo platform. It is therefore reasonable to worry if their preservation as a coherent collection is failing. GPO needs a stronger focus or abilities to enable it to build this coherent collection of federal publications, or an alternative other than GPO must be found for doing so. This issue must be addressed both prospectively and retrospectively to ensure that gaps in holdings of digital and digitized publications are filled. Additionally, I would question whether GPO should have sole responsibility for digital preservation. Best practice is for preservation responsibilities to be transferred from the creator and publisher to one or more third parties representing the users of publications. Consequently, there should be a strong third-party role for preservation of federal publications. The government should have a formal agreement with this third party and provide stable financial support. This third party would take custody of publications when they are issued and maintain them in a diversity of political jurisdictions, including, in this case, at least one jurisdiction outside the United States. At any point that publications become unavailable through normal channels, the third party would ensure that public access is not interrupted. The FDLP could be restructured to provide for such a model, or GPO could contract with a third party outside of the parameters of the FDLP. I thank this committee for your work to ensure preservation and access to government publications. By modernizing the FDLP and aligning it with preservation best practices, you can help to ensure that these vital government publications will remain available for the American public for generations to come. I look forward to your questions.
I want to thank each of you for your testimony. This is an issue that's very important, I believe, to the future of how all of this is going to work. The gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Comstock, is rotating between 3 different hearings set all during the same time that she will have to run. So I'm going to take a liberty as chair and recognize Ms. Comstock first for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Peterson, in your testimony, you stated that Congress could consider a process by which the potential adoption of newer technologies and approaches reflective of emerging information management practices might be specified in statute. Could you explain how Congress could delegate that authority to GPO? Would it be through some rulemaking process, or how that might be done?
Thank you for the question. I guess the first step is to identify a technology adoption process, and this is one option for considering how to implement the flexibility to bring in emerging technologies over time. One option is an expert panel, folks who look at this stuff, folks like Mr. Schoenfeld, who study it deeply and can see what's coming and how the extent to what existing technologies are, expiring or being overtaken by newer things. What then could happen is that the process of technology determination could be enacted as the method of implementing it. And this could be overseen by GPO, this could be overseen by another entity, and it would potentially be a regulatory option. GPO could implement these things by regulation. Perhaps the statute could mandate that the technology development process be carried out at a regular interval, and then in the absence of some manner of objection, be implemented that way. There are a number of options as to how that could move forward.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Schoenfeld, in your testimony, you talked about a third-party role for preservation. Could you expand upon that? And as you mentioned, the Federal Information Preservation Network, would that effort by GPO be enough to preserve the federal collection?
Thank you for the question. In terms of third-party preservation, we have developed a system. Ms. Dale is actually one of the originators of it, of certifying trusted digital repositories. It's a process that makes it possible for us to have assurance that these repositories are audited and certified. Even if FedSys or GovInfo, the GPO's repositories, were to be certified as trustworthy, governance principles would still argue for a strong third party that itself would be certified as trustworthy. But as you may know, GPO attempted to have its own digital repositories certified, and this certification has not yet been received. This should perhaps cause some special concerns for us about whether GPO is in the right position here. I would answer about the Federal Information Preservation Network that by saying that what GPO really needs to establish here is a risk-informed set of preservation goals. And I think that's really what we're talking about. How do you understand what the risks are, what the risk factors are, relative to the resources that are available for addressing those risks? That would yield a set of technical objectives, like how many copies do you need under what environmental conditions, and so forth for the digital side. But the answer is not just to get as much as possible. Preservation isn't about as much as possible. That can yield far too much preservation and therefore inefficiency, or it can yield far too little preservation, putting materials that we care about at risk. So I would say that thinking about how GPO could get to a more risk-informed way of thinking about preservation against the trade-offs and resources that are required would be an important step forward.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes for questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Let's see, Mr. Peterson, let me just start with you. You piqued my interest with your the invocation of the Chadha decision, which of course found that the Congress, when it acts in its legislative capacity, must act bicamerally with presentment to the President. Are you suggesting that that creates a problem for each House essentially controlling its own printing and publishing operations? Was that the relevance of it?
No, sir. It had to do with the capacity to implement 44 U.S.C. 501, which states that all government printing goes through the government publishing office at the direction of the Joint Committee on Printing. And following the decision, in 1983, a number of executive branch agencies spent the next decade asking why GPO and JCP were in this position in light of Chadha. So as a consequence where with the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel's opinions that JCP had no constitutional role in light of Chadha, executive agencies chose to take their printing business, many executive agencies chose to take their printing business elsewhere, either doing it within the agency or contracting out on their own authorities. A consequence of this is because of the funding model of GPO, that GPO had less revenue to support the various non-printing activities that it's been assigned to over the past 25 years.
I see. But, and that's an historical process that's continued of the executive agencies?
I would say it's reasonably set at this point, but it is the turning point at which Congress began to question what JCP might do in the future, and it changed a little bit the model of how GPO went out and found work from the executive branch.
Gotcha. Thank you. Ms. Deal, a lot of libraries don't have big endowments and are facing shrinking local budgets today. And as the committee considers providing grant-making authority to the GPO, what can we learn from your grant-making program about how to make this an effective operation if it's to happen?
Thank you for the question. I would say in terms of the IMLS grant-making and drawing parallels, it is about the ability to understand the scope and the scale of what grant-making would be within there, and ensure that there are proper controls in place as we do have at IMLS. We, as I mentioned earlier, we have anything from fiscal controls, we have appropriate peer review and grant making and grant selection. We have grants that run from the tens of thousands up into the millions of dollars. So we have appropriate processes and procedures in place that allow us to scale and address those needs as they come in. I would say that those principles are things that would need to be in place for this program should the grant-making authority be something you decide upon. Of course, IMLS doesn't have a position at this time in terms of the question and within the legislative and administrative purview of the committee to address the grant-making authority.
Thank you. And Mr. Schoenfeld, finally, you say that preservation of government information may require or ideally requires the involvement of a third party, and I think you suggested in your testimony possibly outside of the country. Who becomes responsible for maintaining the security of that information, both in its digital and tangible forms, if we were to delegate it to a third party?
Thank you for the question. Just to make sure that it's clear, I don't mean to suggest that the third party itself has to be administratively located outside of the country, but that the preservation best practice would call for at least one copy of the materials to be held in a jurisdiction outside of the country. So just to make sure that that I didn't leave any ambiguity there. The question as to security of the information. In this case, I believe we're talking about publications of the government, which is to say materials that are publicly accessible. So I think that there are questions about not so much about security in terms of keeping them from being made available, but certainly there are questions about authentication and making sure that the materials themselves are authenticated and authentic. And I think that there are processes and procedures in place technically through some of the existing third-party preservation entities that would accommodate for that kind of question.
Great. Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you. Thank you much.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And again, thanks to each of you for being here. Dr. Peterson, as the committee prepares to work on and rewrite Title 44, what guidance would you give us to ensure success?
Well, Mr. Chairman, as you know, the Congressional Research Service doesn't tell Congress what to do. That's not just in statute, that's pursuant to fairly regular reminders from this committee, among others.
But we're very open-minded, and we're okay. While you can't, tell us, you can suggest heavily.
Well, I think that there is a long 2.5-decade process of considering the position of the Joint Committee on Printing. I think there are regular conversations related, and you just had a piece of that with the clerk a few minutes ago, considering the specificity of the types and amounts of printing that need to happen moving forward. We know that most users, for example, rely on the digital manifestations of most congressional documents. At the same time, there are archival purposes for tangible processes because we don't have an enduring archival standard for digital things. There are still people who like to look at it and mark it up. So there's going to be something there. I don't think, for example, on the Congressional Record, there are somewhere north of 29,000 copies of the daily edition authorized. My understanding from GPO's budget submission is that they print about 1,700 or so. And while that authorization has been made, there isn't a public record of where it's been made or under what authority. And surfacing those sorts of bits of information about how the printing process works, how the distribution process works, may be helpful in elevating the transparency of the government information process.
Thank you for that, those suggestions. Thank you. Ms. Dale, if I may ask you, has IMLS ever been defined in statute to handle grant making for an agency or other entity in government?
So we have a number. There's a bit in the written testimony that was provided in terms of the interagency agreements that we have done with our grant-making authority that delves into that realm, including when establishing the National Museum of African American History and Culture through Public Law 108-104, Congress authorized IMLS to establish grant programs to build the capacity of museums of the African American history and culture in consultation with the Director of Museums, and we also, with the Department of Interior, leverages IMLS's peer review and grant-making expertise to award and manage library and museum-related grants for collections care. So we do have partnerships and advise other agencies on those matters.
So you've had that collaboration with
Yes, sir.
with other federal agencies. What models for collaboration have worked well in the past? And notwithstanding a possible inclusion in statute, are there opportunities for IMLS to collaborate with GPO?
Certainly, there's precedent there for IMLS to be able to collaborate with GPO on I'd imagine any numbers. As I mentioned, there were two different examples there. There are others that we could provide that where we have worked with other agencies and assisted them with grant programs. Those were the two that were easiest. I would say that we are certainly flexible and willing to hear more about the interest. Again, we don't have a particular position on which way that the committee would choose to go, but we would certainly be willing to take in any questions you might have and provide any further technical assistance or advice on options.
And certainly you know, as you stated earlier, there are grants given in various amounts from
Yes, sir. From 10,000 to
thousands
millions.
to millions.
Yes, sir.
What level of funding would a grant-making program need in order to be effective?
So I'll take that back to my earlier comment about scale and scope. And I think it really depends on the goals of the program and whether it would be competitive or if there is a sort of grants to states-based model where a certain amount of money is given to every state based upon some formula. And then I would just say that there is certainly a need to provide the level of oversight and review and financial accountability. And certainly we continue to work on all the processes to make sure that they're in place, and we do improvements all the time. But there is a great deal of work assisting, both providing technical assistance to grantees, but as well as the entire grant-making process.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin, do you have any follow-up questions in light of my questioning?
I do not, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. I want to thank each of you for being here. This is it's a very important process. It may not appear to be the most glamorous topic as we go through Title 44, but it's very important how we're going to operate and how we're going to move forward. And I know, Mr. Schoenfeld, you mentioned that as well. And before I close out the questioning, just one quick question. 20 years ago, we could never have imagined the digital transformation of storage of this. Do you have a glimpse, as you study this, where we're going to be in 20 years?
Well, I think that we are going to see the transition from print to digital formats continue to accelerate. The transition from tangible to digital formats continue to accelerate, and I think that we're going to see all sorts of ways that we'll move from static publications to more interactive kinds of information resources. At the same time, I think we've seen that the transition has not taken place as quickly for many formats as some people would have expected, and we have to be cautious in how we make that transition so that we respond to reading behaviors, that as libraries we support the needs of the public and the academics who need the materials that we have. So I think we're going to see an increasingly digital future, but one where libraries have a very strong role, and a stronger role even in providing preservation and access and other services.
Great. Well, you look at how things have changed from 8 tracks to iTunes. It's been remarkable, and I'm sure we're going to see that and the roles that we're all playing here. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit to the chair additional written witness questions that could be forwarded to each witness to answer as promptly as they can in order for those to be made a part of the record. Without objection, this hearing is adjourned.